Chapter 1: The Mountains of Virginia. It was the year 2010, and I had just graduated as a lieutenant from the West Point Military Academy. My first assignment was in the 10th Infantry Battalion, located in the Appalachian Mountains in the state of Virginia. This unit was known for being constantly in training operations and combat exercises in extreme conditions. I quickly realized that it wasn't going to be an easy job. We would spend weeks at a time in the forest, training in rain and snow, and only return to the base for a couple of days before heading back into the field. When I arrived at the unit, Captain Simmons gathered all the new officers and assigned us to our respective companies. I was assigned to Bravo Company, and my initial mission was to lead a group in a simulated combat exercise in a region known as Red Oak Ridge, a remote and mountainous area. As we prepared to leave, the operations sergeant, Sergeant Mayer, gave me a warning. "Be careful in Red Oak Ridge, Lieutenant. They say those mountains are cursed. If you see anything strange, just ignore it and keep moving." I laughed at his comment, thinking he was just trying to scare us. After all, I was an infantry soldier, trained to face anything. I grabbed my gear, gathered my platoon, and we set off for Red Oak Ridge at dusk. The trip was uneventful, and we arrived at our destination in the middle of the night. We set up camp and established a security perimeter. I ordered the soldiers to rest, as we would start the exercise the next day. I sat by the campfire, gazing at the stars, when suddenly an old man emerged from the trees. His appearance was strange. He wore old-fashioned clothes, and his eyes seemed dull. "Be careful, boy," the man said to me. "You shouldn't be here tonight. The spirits don't rest well in these mountains. November 11th is a particularly dangerous day." I thanked him for the warning, but I didn't give it much thought. I assumed he was a local hunter or maybe someone living in a cabin in the woods. When I asked for his name, he just turned around and disappeared into the trees. Chapter 2: The Night of November 11th. A couple of days passed, and the training was going as planned. The soldiers were tired, but everything seemed to be in order. However, the night of November 11th changed everything. Around midnight, while everyone was sleeping, I was awakened by a strange sound. It was a soft wail, almost a whisper, coming from deep within the forest. I got up and left my tent, thinking that one of the soldiers might be in trouble. Outside, I saw one of my men, Corporal Johnson, standing at the edge of the camp, staring into the trees. "What's going on, Johnson?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He just pointed toward the darkness. Looking in the direction he was pointing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the dim light of the forest, there were white figures gliding among the trees. Their shapes were barely visible, but I could make out vague faces and hands that seemed to be reaching toward us. I tried to turn on my flashlight, but it wouldn't work. Corporal Johnson started murmuring something, his words incoherent, as if he was in a trance. I tried to shake him out of it, but it was useless. Suddenly, a chilling wind blew from the forest, extinguishing the campfire and plunging the camp into total darkness. The wailing grew louder, and it seemed like the figures were getting closer. I ordered everyone to get up and prepare to move, but in the confusion, Sergeant Miller, who was in charge of the night watch, noticed that 3 men were missing. Amid the chaos, I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the forest. Without thinking, I grabbed my rifle and ran toward the sound, followed by a few of my men. Chapter 3: The Encounter. We plunged into the forest, following the screams. Eventually, we reached a clearing, where we saw one of the missing soldiers, Private Ramirez, standing next to a tree, staring at something we couldn't see. As I approached, I saw his face was pale, and his eyes were wide open, as if he had seen something beyond human comprehension. I tried to speak to him, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly and saw the white figures approaching. Now I could see their faces clearly. They were pale, with empty eyes and mouths open in silent screams. I tried to raise my rifle, but I felt my hands were frozen. I couldn't move. The figures were getting closer and closer, and one of them reached out its hand toward me. At that moment, I heard a gunshot. One of my men had fired into the air, breaking the trance. The figures vanished in a whisper of wind, and Private Ramirez collapsed to the ground, unconscious. We carried him and ran back to the camp, not looking back. When we arrived, I saw Captain Simmons waiting for us. I told him what had happened, but he didn't seem surprised. "There are things in these mountains that we can't explain," he said quietly. "The important thing is that everyone gets back safe." Chapter 4: The March Back. At dawn, we packed up the camp and prepared to leave. The soldiers were visibly shaken by what had happened, but no one talked about it. As we walked back along the trail, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around and saw the old man who had warned me that first night. "I told you," he said with a sad smile. "Not everyone who enters these mountains comes back. Not on this night." And before I could reply, he vanished into thin air, as if he had never been there. When we got back to the base, I made my report to Captain Simmons, but I left out the more supernatural details. No one would have believed we were attacked by ghosts, and I didn't want to be taken for a madman. However, that night, when I went to sleep, I heard a whisper in my tent. It was the same voice I had heard in the forest, calling my name. "Betancourt," the voice whispered, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around, but no one was there. I turned off my flashlight and tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, although deep down, I knew there was something more in those mountains, something that wouldn't rest until it claimed more souls. Since then, every November 11th, I remember that night in the Appalachian Mountains and pray that the spirits find peace. But in my heart, I know that one day, they'll come back for me.